you also have to compare what is the cancer risk if you carry on being obese.
Right.
And the evidence about the degree to which obesity increases cancer risk and causes cancer is extraordinary. I was stunned by the research on this. Cancer Research UK, the biggest cancer charity in Britain, explains to people, if you carry excess weight, and it doesn't have to be much excess weight, if you carry excess weight, that fat doesn't just sit there. It's not inert. It's active. It sends signals throughout your body. And one of the signals it can send is for cells to divide more rapidly, which can cause cancer. It's why, your cancer risk really significantly increases if you're obese. So again, some people will be hearing that thyroid cancer risk, and this is why the FDA in the US warns people who have thyroid cancer in their family, don't take the drug. I think the FDA is right about that. But also you have to then weigh that against the other competing risk, which is, if you're going to continue to be obese. In terms of the other risks, there's lots. The one that I'm most worried about is not one that would affect me. I'm really worried about, which is what people with eating disorders will do when they get hold of these drugs, and indeed are already doing. So we know there are very large numbers of young women, it's overwhelmingly young women, who are trying to starve themselves. We also know that hugely increased during the pandemic from an already very high level. And these drugs are a way to amputate your appetite, right? If you take a high enough dose, you just won't eat. I spoke to eating disorders experts who are already seeing these problems presenting themselves. And in the worst case scenario, I can see an opioid style death toll of just enormous numbers of young women who, as a result of these drugs, are able to starve themselves to death in ways they would not have been able to do had these drugs not been released. Now, there's a way we can hugely reduce that risk, which is, at the moment, if you want these drugs, Andrew, you can just go on Zoom. You could have any BMI you wanted. They're meant to assess your BMI. It's very hard to do that on Zoom. They're obviously not meant to give it to people with a BMI lower than 27. They're meant to do some kind of reasonable assessment. But in practice, no one's doing that. When I'm in Vegas and I have to get them, I go to a place, they don't know. By the time I went there, because I initially got them in Britain, by the time I went there to get them in Vegas, I was below the BMI you should be to get them. Obviously, I was taking it to maintain my lower BMI, so it was legitimate, but I could have just been lying about that, right? I didn't check. So, and they gave them to me without even asking, right? I went in with a BMI.
Just at a regular pharmacist?
You have to go to a doctor, but, I went to a doctor but in practice, I imagine Vegas is slightly worse than the rest of the US for all the reasons that Vegas is slightly worse for everything than the rest of the US. But, they're not checking, right? So what a lot of the experts, like Dr. Kimberly Dennis, who's one of the leading experts on this, say, I think quite rightly, is you should only be able to get these drugs if you see a doctor in person. That doctor can check your BMI, and that doctor is trained in spotting people with eating disorders, right? That's obviously not a perfect block. People can get things illegally online. They could send their friends to do it. But that would at least limit what I think will be a very serious problem, and is already emerging as a serious problem.
My question with that is, these young women are often perfectly well capable of starving themselves without these drugs, and are obviously often at very painfully low weights. Are you saying this just would increase their ability never to feel hungry, and so it would increase their ability to wither away?
It massively supercharges your ability to starve yourself. There's no doubt about that. You got to think about it. Anyone who's known people with anorexia, as I have, knows, they are conflicted. They have powerful psychological forces that are driving them to starve themselves. And they have powerful biological forces that drive them to eat. And they're in an internal conflict between that psychological desire to starve and the biological impulse to stay alive. And what these drugs do, if you take them in high enough doses, is just smother those biological impulses further. And we don't need to speculate about this. We've been here before. In the early 90s, there was an amphetamine-based diet drug. Congressman Rob Wyden of Ohio organized congressional hearings on this, that loads of young women used to starve themselves to death. And it's heartbreaking testimony. A guy called Tony Smith from State Center in Iowa testifies about his daughter Noelle. Was very anorexic, gets hold of this drug and kills herself with it, dies of a heart attack because she's so emaciated, in a way that, of course, some anorexics kill themselves anyway, but it makes it much easier to do.